right, so I'm going to talk today, I'm going to talk today about a convenient verisimilitude or oppressive internalization, characterizing the ethical arguments surrounding hierarchical structures in knowledge organization systems. All right, so hierarchy, broadly defined, is a ranking, and though it is applied in many contexts, in the case of bibliographic classification, we're concerned with classes of documents ranked from broad to narrow meaning. There are various ways we can formalize and operationalize this general definition. For example, we might say that broad classes have a greater extension and lesser intention than lower classes. This would mean that there are more items, documents, in a broader class than a narrower class. Likewise, the narrower class would have more characteristics, that is, greater intention, than the broader one. This we will call, for our purposes, the functional argument. However, some have ascribed an interpretation of hierarchy that reads something like this. Hierarchy is harmful because it is a tool of the dominant paradigm, and the dominant paradigm causes harm through marginalization, through power structures, etc. For example, there are arguments that hierarchy is a realization of patriarchy, and hence any knowledge organization system that uses this structure reflects a patriarchal bias. That's one argument. It can also be said that hierarchy just looks like the power structure of patriarchy, and as such, should be dismantled to show a form of resistance to patriarchal norms. And here I cite Daly, who's in cahoots with Jane Caputi, in her Webster's New Intergalactic Wikidary from 1982. Likewise, we might see the divide and control tree diagram of hierarchy schematized as a tool of colonial domination, and so link this structure with settler mentality. And here I cite a doctoral student who's working at the University of, where am I from? University of Washington in Seattle, Ali Krebs. The second group of perspectives we'll call emancipation argument, or the emancipation argument. Each is unique, but for the sake of time, I will not enumerate their differences, however interesting they may be. I only want to highlight that each of these perspectives sees the hierarchical form as the realization of oppressive thinking. Okay, so it stands in place of, or actually is, oppressive thinking. But what do these two arguments have in common, and how are they different? There are two camps in knowledge organization literature that with regard to this hierarchy and its ethical stance. One integrates the semantics and structure of hierarchy into one concern, that is, the semantics, the meaning of a class, is directly related to its relationship within the structure, and one separates them. The former links the actions of hierarchy described above to the analysis of a domain and the definition of a term. And while this is appropriate in some contexts, in others, it is not. It calls to our attention the way in which we conflate these parts of the knowledge organization system, but it also removes agency for those outside of the dominant paradigm to use hierarchy for their needs. That is, if we label hierarchy as only the tool of oppression, no one who's oppressed can use the tool, if it's a categorical statement such as that. I will advocate for separating semantics and structure, because I believe in so doing we highlight the agency we have in making ethical knowledge organization systems. I believe we have the power to do it, and I want to have tools available for us to do that. Agency and intention are key ethical concerns I have in the context of knowledge organization and classification theory. And here, unfortunately, I can only cite presentations, as I have not yet put pen to paper for these particular presentations. But one is in a video, so if you're interested in 2009, I can send you the link. So now I want to talk about semantics and structure. In the context of classification schemes, the examples par excellence of hierarchy, we can often separate structure from semantics. For example, automobiles might be a superclass and Mazda a subclass. Just as easily, we might have automobiles as the superclass and blue cars as a subclass. The structure is the same. In both cases, we have a hierarchical relationship, and in both cases, we added at least one characteristic to the superclass to generate one, and potentially many other, subclasses. We can contrast this with semantics. The difference between Mazda and blue car as classes is their definition, how we define, in this case, their meaning. So Mazda, in the case, is a particular make of car, and blue car is the set of all those cars that are blue in the context of a classification scheme. There are, of course, intersections between structure and semantics. We know the hierarchical structure, if it is coherent, we know from the hierarchical structure, if it's coherent, that Mazda, in this case, is the make of car, and not the car company, not the god of wisdom, intelligence, and harmony. Right? We do have some context. We also know that the class blue car does not refer to train cars, but only to automobiles. In its original conception, hierarchy was used to describe the orders of angels by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who was flourishing in the 5th to 6th centuries. This we see from the Oxford English Dictionary. So these are the orders of the angels: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones being the closest to God, dominations, virtues, and powers being further removed from the divine being, and principalities, archangels, and angels being the furthest removed. In this sense, we can see the concept of rulership, of governance, in this idea of hierarchy. And so we start to feel the idea of power and power relations in hierarchy through this example. In biology, hierarchy groups, or hierarchical groups, are kinds of organisms, in biology, hierarchy groups kinds of organisms by current or not theories of kinds. And these are often contentious and refined based on new data. There's a very strong tradition in taxonomy of revising the taxonomic class, so thereby putting an organism in another place on the tree of life. So here's an example of what a species record might look like, and we can see a very familiar set of hierarchical statements from the very top kingdom, which have been debated countless times over the history of biology. There are many different kinds of kingdoms, all the way down to the subspecies in this case, and then we get the citation of this particular classification. In both of these cases, we're trying to show some relationship. In the first, we're concerned with how close an angel is to God. The second, we are concerned with showing the descendant relationships of organisms, which is theorized to come from some common ancestor, but is now differentiated. These structures are related to what we build into our classification schemes. We want to show relationships, and we want to show how the whole of the collection is interrelated. We have other requirements as well. If we define classification quite strictly as the mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive set of hierarchically and systematically arranged classes, then we can see how hierarchy is a design feature. That is, it is meant to do something. Oh, meant to do something. That's for emphasis. Sorry about that. So it's meant to do something. So we're back to intention. Hierarchy in classification schemes is a design feature, an intervention. It is the primary tool for precision and recall in systems that use classification. The broader the class, the higher the recall. The narrower the class, the higher the precision. And here's an example of the 1913 excerpt from Dewey, where we see evolution in 575, and then the subclasses are supposed to comprise all those things at the time that were thought to be relevant to evolution from the authors of the DDC. What I like about this is it's not written here, but you can actually get to here from eugenics in the relative index under 575.1 in this particular case, under heredity, although there are a number of other caveats to class has besides that. I also like the handwriting here. This is definitely an example of craft work at work. All right. Now that we've walked through the hierarchical structure, showing how I believe it is distinct yet connected to semantics, we can see that how the meaning of a class, its semantics in the classification scheme, is contextualized by its structure. Semantics in this case, though, I'm going to define as the definition of a class. So we can ask, what is a definition? I think there are two types, definition by intention and definition by extension. Intention is definition through the use of the genus and differentia of a term, so outlining its attributes. The extension is definition through the enumeration of every example of that term. So, for example, the intention of the University of Washington High School Dean might be the chief academic administrator in charge of the information school. Whereas the extension of all University of Washington High School deans might be Mike Eisenberg and Harry Bruce, both past and present deans. Intention of the high school dean, the chief academic administrator in charge of the information school, we see with this above example that we can see we have characteristics that should be put into a hierarchy, right? If we take out those characteristics, we can start to line them up. So we have chief academic administrator, and we have information school by my lights. And both of these could be subclass or superclass, right? We've made no commitment simply by identifying the attributes of which order they go in. We can decide later, if we want to, which order they go into. The extension of the high school dean, like Eisenberg and Harry Bruce, well, this one's not so good at giving us attributes. We don't, from this list, get a set of characteristics that we can use to establish any kind of order, hierarchical or otherwise. However, this is the only way that we can begin to construct some intentional definitions, is through extension, gathering examples. And only from gathering these examples can we begin to interpret or impose characteristics that we can use to group classes. So the example here might be the platypus, right? As famously written up by Umberto Eco in 2000 in his book *Kant and the Platypus*. The characteristics of the animal, right, which we find, the features we might use to put it into its place in the tree of life, were in fact contradictory to taxonomy at the time. Though we could identify the characteristics, there was no path through the tree that led us to the platypus. And I think it's an example of what could be, since it exists, it's an example of what could be, and its being is what's made it its place, so a place in the hierarchy. So now I want to talk about intention and agency. We can close with a discussion of the relationship of hierarchy to intention and agency, and answer the question as to whether or not hierarchy is a convenient verisimilitude or an oppressive internalization. Intention is a focal point of my philosophical stance. As a neo-pragmatic Zen Buddhist, I must acknowledge that I have agency in my work with words, that they're useful, and I can shape the world with my words and actions. There can also be unintended consequences, and so I'm sorry for that up front. To this end, a functional argument seems to me to be the only way to examine hierarchical structures. If it is a tool to be used by anyone, then we have to add it to our toolbox. It has to be added to the toolbox for anyone to use. So this also opens up the possibility of interpreting other forms of structure as tools to be used, perhaps for different purposes, right? So if we're functionalists, we have a particular purpose in mind when we're dealing with hierarchy. For example, I can imagine many functions for a web of interconnected nodes as outlined by Olson, or schemes following Day and Caputi, which is how she organized her Webster's New Intergalactic Wikidictionary, was by schemes, throwing off the patriarchal structure she saw in dictionaries. However, these structures may not function in the same way, right? So they may provide something else. They may add value in a different way. Further, separating structure from semantics in the functional stance allows us to closely examine assumed definitions, often left out of many knowledge organization systems, and make them more explicit, thereby acting intentionally. So if we're very clear about our definition of classes, we know whether or not our structure is broken because we're removing the definition from the structure and reassessing the structure in light of that definition, or perhaps even redefinition. So is hierarchy a convenient verisimilitude or oppressive internalization? Neither. Hierarchy neither represents reality robustly or in shorthand, nor does it in and of itself serve as an oppressive internalization in my mind. In the first case, we can see many different realities when we analyze the structure and semantics of the domain, and we should be sensitive to those possibilities, all about Prince Tar. In the latter case, we remove agency of the oppressed if we say that hierarchy is not to be used in a functional manner because it is besmirched by the conflation of semantics and structure. If our work is the work of craft, as Olson says, then we must have, and now Cope says as well, then we must have the appropriate tools to do such work. Thank you.
You still have more time also. So, questions for either of these speakers? Melanie.
I have a question as well. Something I think that's interesting, especially in terms of sexual practices, is that there isn't always an available vocabulary for them. And so that's why some of these euphemisms have to come up. Either I'm trying to use your language, the one with the O, orthophonism, yes, thank you. That either doesn't exist or it's maybe too clinical. I guess, do you have any comment on sort of the instability of the or the change in the euphemisms or diaphragmatisms, or if I said that one right, struggling with those, in the indexing language, the value of adding them if they change a lot, or if they don't have a sort of generic term?
In fact, indexing language doesn't use to add euphemism and euphemism in this way. But Fabio and I, when we started to think about this topic, we thought that this is an interesting exercise to do during the relationship, making the relationships between terms. Because we know that as a constructed language, we can add a lot of euphemism and these feminisms in indexing language. So yeah, when I did my master's research, I didn't find this kind of words in indexing language. But I think that this kind of exercise is useful for librarians.
Yeah, because if they were there, we would increase retrieval, like you said. But then the problem is that if they change so quickly, then it would be difficult to keep a handle on them. Okay, thank you.
Cool. You were waiting. Well, I guess my question about hierarchy is that I don't think a tool is necessarily neutral. And so if you look back and think about statements like you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, and I had to think about this actually when I did my dissertation back then, because at first I wasn't ready to accept that, and finally I did. And I think what put me over the edge was the concept of hierarchical force. Because if you know your Dewey, especially read the introduction, it talks about hierarchical force as saying that anything that applies to the broadest class applies to everything underneath it. And so there is a semantic relationship in that case between, or a semantic and structural relationship. So I guess I'm thinking you're dealing with essential characteristics here by having to create those classes that have those particular characteristics. And I think that does make a difference in the nature of the tool, makes a difference in applying it. And the other thing, of course, is that in a hierarchical arrangement, you leave all other kinds of relationships out. And so, I mean, I think it would be very interesting to explore a relationship entity model for classification rather than just for bibliographic purposes. So there you
Yeah. I agree that we should explore all of the different kinds of structure that we have available to us. But without starting to separate it out from, say, semantics or intentional definitions of terms or classes, we have a hard time doing that, I think. I don't think that we have as much flexibility unless we start to separate them out. And, you know, historically, I think the idea of hierarchical force has done a lot of violence within the context of Dewey, for sure. But when I read, for example, Ranganathan, right, and talk about, you know, it's completely abstract in that I am, you know, late 20th century, early 21st century information professional, or, you know, thinker in the area, maybe. I can imagine all sorts of characteristics I could line up in lots of different ways that would functionally be emancipatory, right? So, but I'm still using hierarchy, right, in that particular case. But I completely agree with you. It eliminates all other relationship types. That's not its function. It's not functioning that way. And in my mind, it's a way of showing characteristics you've identified of classes and ranking which ones come first for the ease of reducing ambiguity and ideally saving time for the user. Now, again, that could cause harm if you're not doing it with some intention, if you're not doing it with some compassion. But I think I personally think that we can separate those things out, but we should also explore other relationship types and other structures, for sure.
Right. Well, the other aspect to add is that basically hierarchy is like our classifications are built on traditional logic. And the extension and the intention are hierarchical in nature. just like inductive and deductive reasoning. And so if we can't look, I mean, it gets very difficult when you have hierarchy in everything to look beyond it. And I think maybe what we need is a couple centuries without it. And then maybe we can go back and make some use of it when it isn't the master's tool anymore.
Let us live that long.
Other questions? What's your pleasure? Back to you.
Back to the. All right, here we go. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks, Sue Ellen, for her talk. And I would also like to. Is Joyce here yet? Not yet. Okay, so we'll recognize Joyce at the end of the break. But where we're at now, folks, is getting ready for the final talk. So we'll take a break. We might reconvene a little bit earlier, since we're breaking a little bit early. Let me look at the time. Geez. No, break isn't even here. So.
Shall we have a test?
Yeah, let's do a test. Let's see. Hopefully we can get the break here by before 2, and we'll try to reconvene around 10 after 2. Sound good?
Yeah.
Awesome.